I remember D.A. Carson saying one time, I've learned that people don't learn what I teach them. They learn what I'm excited about. This is what is so palpable when, whether you're a Bible study or a preacher comes to the pulpit, if people feel like Pastor Kevin was in the study all week and I learned something, I saw something, I want you to see something. This is really cool. You could be talking about almost anything. If they sense he saw something, guys, everybody, he saw something. People listen.
What do you do as a Bible teacher when you're given the responsibility to teach a passage you and your congregation are unfamiliar with?
In today's episode, we sat down with Kevin DeYoung, Senior Pastor of Christ Covenant Church, North Carolina, and asked him about a recent talk he preached on Revelation chapter 8, verses 1 to 5. A talk you can listen to on our channel wherever you listen to the Bible Matters podcast. It's arguably a lesser-known passage in the book of Revelation and concerns John's vision of the opening of the seventh scroll, which precedes the Lord's coming judgment.
We asked Kevin about the book of Revelation in general and how a Bible teacher can overcome their fear of studying and teaching it, as well as about prayer, the subject of Revelation 8, and we discussed how rather than a feeble act, the Christian's prayers are actually the moments which will come to define history. My name's Leo Elborn.
And my name's Tiff Stromso, and this is the Bible Matters podcast, encouraging faithful Bible teaching and ministry. Kevin DeYoung, welcome to the podcast.
It is great to be here and glad to be here remotely from sunny North Carolina.
Kevin, if I, your average Christian, really remembered every day that Jesus is actually returning, how would it change my life?
Well, I didn't say you were an average Christian. Tiffany, you may be a very above average Christian. I mean, it's one of those things we all believe as Christians. We say it in the Apostles' Creed that Jesus Christ is returning to judge the living and the dead. It's supposed to be our blessed hope, his glorious appearing. And yet, I think behind your question is a sense, which is unfortunately true, that many of us, pastors and ordinary Christians, don't think a lot about it. So, biblically, I think of the motivation in 2 Peter. One of the explicit motivations is, in light of Christ's return, what sort of people ought we to be? So we ought to live lives of holiness and godliness. So there's that. It would also put into perspective our suffering, this light and momentary affliction, achieving for us an eternal weight of glory. And it would give us, to use that language of a blessed hope, a glorious appearing, a sense of joy, of an anticipation. I mean, you get to the end of Revelation and it's come, Lord Jesus. There's a delight. There's an anticipation. Was it C.S. Lewis who, if there's something that sounds smart, you just say, it wasn't a C.S. Lewis, but, Lewis argued that really human joy is so much in the anticipation of something. And very rarely does the thing itself, when it arrives, even match the anticipation of the joy. Now, with Christ's return, it will be superseded, but it is really just like a kid looks forward to Christmas or a birthday, or we look forward to a marriage or a baby or a new job or something. I mean, infinitely better is Christ's return. And so it ought to be a pulsing through the Christian's heart of joy that Jesus is coming back.
Kevin, we're here today to talk to you a little bit about the book of Revelation, which is, of course, in part about Christ's return. But in particular, we're going to talk to you about a series you've been preaching in the book of Revelation, and focusing particularly on one sermon you did on Revelation chapter 8, verse 1 to 5. But before we jump into that, can I just ask, Revelation has a reputation, a sort of reputation. It's difficult, it's weird, it's really hard to understand. I think for the longest time, I just kind of resigned myself to never understanding this book. Can I just ask you, have you ever struggled with that reputation of Revelation? Was there anything that helped you to navigate it?
For sure. I think there are two types of Christian churches. There are those that do a annual series on Revelation and Daniel and Ezekiel and the end times, and that would often be a dispensational church. And then there are those churches that seem to never touch Revelation except for a nice series on 2 and 3 of the 7 letters, and maybe 4 and 5 or around Easter or something. So I definitely grew up in the second kind of church, grew up in a Reformed church. And famously, John Calvin, so one of my theological heroes, wrote a commentary on almost every book of the New Testament except Revelation.
Oh, dear.
And I remember the first time when I was teaching on Revelation, my dear mother even said to me, "But Kevin, not even John Calvin wrote the commentary on Revelation.
You think you're better than Calvin?"
Yeah, you think you know more than John Calvin. So I've now in different ways have taught through either Sunday school or other things, or years ago in my other church. So I preached through Revelation. I did it in my first church as a Sunday school class, and then my previous church about now 15, 16 years ago, I did it. So now I'm doing it again. And of course, they're not identical sermons by any means. But yeah, when I first really started digging in, I realized this is confusing. I can remember as a Christian in college not having really been taught much about Revelation that I can remember, trying to lay out, or I'm just going to go chapter by chapter, and just instinctively, like a lot of churches do, I'm going to just draw out the timeline. I'm just going to, okay, this happened and this happened and this happened. And it's all going to make sense. And then you get about halfway through and this is not making sense. So we believe in the clarity of Scripture. We believe that ordinary Christians by the Spirit can understand the Bible. And yet this is one of those books in particular that we really are helped by God's gift of teachers and others who can help open this up to us.
Mm-hmm. So it was really kind of consulting with others, which actually really helped you just with the difficulty of it.
Yeah, I think, years ago when I said, I'm going to try to understand Revelation, and it's not a bad instinct to say, I'm going to open my Bible and just dig in. Of course, we want Christians to do that. We realize God gifts a lot of people around us, and sola scriptura doesn't mean solo scriptura, that we're the only people who can do this. So learning more and reading really good commentaries across the spectrum and learning from other people, it is one of those books, I'm sure we'll get into it, but once you kind of get your sea legs about you, once you sort of, I think, get the right lenses to look at it, about halfway through, I think people start saying, it's not like a secret code, but it is having the right lenses over your eyes to understand what sort of book it is and how it works, that I think it really starts to make sense and the picture starts to come into focus.
As you've come to teach this series on Revelation, how has your understanding of the whole book developed?
Like I said, I've taught through Revelation a few times, and each time I go through it, I'm learning new things and seeing new things. So hopefully I'm not completely changing my mind on everything, or that gets very destabilizing. But here and there, I always want to be open to, maybe that verse means something a little bit different. So, honestly, I hadn't looked at Revelation really in in-depth study since, I preached through it at my previous church, like I said, 15, 16 years ago. So going into it again is like, oh yeah, that's what this is about. And there's so many numbers, there's so many pictures. It's the book more than any other New Testament book. It has more allusions and references to the Old Testament. So you have to have a knowledge of what's behind it. You have to understand that the first century reader who's getting Revelation, their frame of reference is not what's happening in Israel in 2023 or 2024, as important as that is. Their frame of reference is their own setting, and they're steeped in biblical language, biblical imagery, and in particular, John, who wrote this book, would have been. So you need to understand those things. And so as I study this now week after week, I'll have people often I stand in the line and past the people go through and shake my hand. Thank you, Pastor. And, one of the most common things people will say in Revelation is, I read the verses ahead of time. I had no idea what you were going to do with this. I had no idea where this was going. It makes so much more sense now. And that's really what you hope to hear in a hard book like this.
So I guess picking up on that point, was there anything about the original context of the book that helped you understand the book as a whole, the situation they were in then?
One of the most important things, if anyone's going to teach this, whether it's a pastor out there or someone just doing a Bible study, any kind of teaching through Revelation, is the very first paragraph, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants the things that must soon take place. So it's a revelation. And then it says, blessed is the one who reads the words of this prophecy. And then John to the 7 churches, and he writes these letters. So I really tried to lay the groundwork at the beginning of this series that Revelation is 3 things. It's an apocalypse, it's a prophecy, and it's a letter. And each of those are really important for understanding how to read this book. So you ask about the context, which is part of that. What were they facing? Is this written in the 70s, as some people think, or AD 90, which is what I think the majority opinion, but it's not a make or break of orthodoxy on that. But it does reflect somewhat how you read some things. But even more important than, who was emperor and, what was the price of bread in the marketplace is understanding the genre. Now, we all get this intuitively with other sorts of books. If you pick up a cookbook, you don't expect, you want it to be very clear, orderly, logical. Tell me how many eggs, how many sticks of butter. If you're reading poetry, you understand it's playing with meter and rhythm. So an apocalypse is a scary word for a lot of us, but it just means it's a book of showing. It's a book of revealing. This book is called Revelation. And just a little tip to people out there, it's not Revelations. So I love the book of Revelations. No, it's just Revelation, singular. So that's really important because it's a certain type of literature. So sometimes people will say, well, do you take Revelation literally? And I say, well, if you mean literally, some people say literally and they mean, do you think it's all true? Well, yes, it's all true. But if you mean literally, should we expect a prostitute riding on a dragon and a beast and, a literal 144,000? No, not because I don't take the Bible to be completely true, but because it's a certain type of book that deals with verbal pictures. It's an apocalypse, it's a prophecy. So prophecy in the Old Testament works a certain way, usually with a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. So I think that's important with Revelation. And then it's a letter. It's a letter. That's significant because it means that real life people, and this is what you're asking, Tiffany, real life people in the first century got this book, and it would have been around a circular letter probably to these 7 churches, Ephesus, Smyrna, etc., in Asia Minor, in Turkey today, and they would have gotten it, and it had to have made some sense to them. Now, maybe they still had to have things explained and unpacked, but you can't. It's a letter, so it wasn't a leaflet dropped out of the heavens. It was to a specific people. So we have to, before we understand what does it mean to us, we have to say, how would they have understood it? What would it have meant to them? And if we zip ahead to start to say, well, the locusts are a helicopter invasion or something, no, that wouldn't have made any sense to the people in the first century reading it.
And I guess then, if John's not doing those things, I know this will have to be oversimplified, but what is John trying to say to those original readers?
So I think there's there's more than one, but you could argue there's one key word or concept in Revelation. And thankfully for most of us in in the world now, we already know this Greek word because you see it on your feet. It's the word Nike. It's a Greek word, Nike or Nikao. It means to conquer. So every time in the 7 letters, to the one who overcomes, to the one who conquers, that's the verb form of, what people have the swoosh on their feet. It's the word for victory, for conquer, for overcoming. I forget off the top of my head. It's something like 11 out of the 18 uses of the word in the New Testament are in Revelation. It's a book. How do we overcome? So each of the 7 churches are facing something different. And I love preaching to the 7 churches because it really, though those were real situations with real churches, it's emblematic of the sort of things that churches face in any age. One church is too accommodating to the culture. Another church has lost its first love. Another church is facing persecution. Another church is big and impressive, but dead. Another church is small, but really strong. So I think John has given us revelation, and the Spirit gave it to John to give to us to say, here are the sort of things that in every age the Church of Jesus Christ can be facing. And in every age, what the church needs most of all, because what follows after Revelation 2 and 3? Revelation 4 and 5, which is a picture of the one who sits on the throne and the Lamb, that what we need most of all is a glorious picture of God and the Son and the Spirit. And so Revelation 6 to the end of the book then is in some ways, it's a really repetitive book. Because it keeps telling us over and over again these kinds of twin themes. Christians, Church of Jesus Christ, you're often going to be opposed. You're often going to be persecuted. But don't lose heart. Don't compromise. Because God sees, He knows, He will protect the church. He will preserve the church. And in the end, Christ is coming to judge the wicked and the unbelieving and to give eternal life to the righteous and the faithful. So that's the message of the book. And once you kind of see it, it's there in every single page.
Kevin, what would you say to the Christian who is just too intimidated by Revelation to really have a go at reading it or studying it?
Lots of Christians feel that way for sure. So I'd say number one, God gives us everything in the Bible for our learning. Read, mark, learn, inwardly digest. There's my Anglican go.
Amen, brother.
Yes, amen. So it's there for our learning. Number two, as I said earlier, you don't have to do this alone. So it could be a Bible study, but it could be a good study Bible. It could be, there's big, massive commentaries. So I use Greg Beale's big, huge commentary. That's a really influential commentary, and he's influenced my interpretation. He has a really big one that's like 1,000 pages, a smaller one that's still really big.
I ordered that one because it was called A Brief. A short commentary. And I thought, great, that's just what I wanted. And then it took like 3 people to carry it up to my flat.
I know. But that old one of the Bible Speaks Today by Michael Wilcock, that gives very much a similar approach to Revelation. So there's lots of good commentaries out there you could use, a sermon series. So there's lots of resources. So I would say to the Christian, it's okay if you're reading something else, but at some point there's a lot here for our learning, and to try to slow down. And I would just say, as much as any book in the Bible, you need to get your bearings straight before you start reading it. You need to understand what sort of book it is and get somebody to at least kind of help. Because I think once you put the right lenses on, it can make more sense more easily than you might think.
I agreed with a buddy of mine, actually. We were both a bit scared about reading Revelation. And so we said, right, let's each read a chapter a day and touch base at the end of the day and discuss it. And it was really helpful. I don't know if we made loads of progress, but it got us into it.
I, on the other hand, my wife and I, we usually listen to a bit of the Bible just before we get to bed. And a few months ago, we were listening to Revelation, and every night it would be like, oh, any idea what those locusts with women's hair are doing? Nope. Good night, darling.
Yeah. Sweet dreams.
Sweet dreams.
Yeah. So maybe read it not right as you fall asleep.
Thanks for the tip. Kevin, I'd love to talk to you about the verses from which you preached on this instance. So chapter 8, verse 1 to 5. And I thought this was really interesting because it's not, I guess, one of the most well-known parts of Revelation. Can you just explain to me why you chose to stop and focus on these 5 verses in particular?
It's a good question because anyone teaching through a book of the Bible has to make decisions along the way about how much to include. And so we can all agree, hey, going through verse by verse is a good idea, whether from the pulpit or in a Bible study. But, there's no right or wrong on how small or how big to get. So I preach through this verse by verse, section by section. And I think by the time I'm done, it will be around 50 sermons. And actually, I did the 7 letters last year. And so I didn't do those this time. I came back to it and sort of picked things up. But adding it all together, it's going to be probably 40 to 50 sermons on the whole thing. So that just gives a sense for the pace that I'm at, about, 2 sermons per chapter. So I got to chapter 8, and it's the 7th seal. So I had done 1 sermon on the first 4 seals, which are the so-called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and then 1 sermon on the 5th seal, and then 1 on the 6th, and then I came to the 7th. And it's a good question because at first, I did think, is there enough here? No, there's always enough there because it's the Bible. But you do think, should I keep going on to the 7 trumpets? Or should I include should I include the first part of chapter 8, these 5 verses, up with the 6th seal? But it seemed to me they had very different themes. So the 6th seal is, the wrath of the Lamb being unfurled and all of the people of the earth cowering. So it was a sermon that needed to talk very specifically about judgment and fearing God. And then chapter 8, or rather that's chapter 6, and then chapter 7 is this interlude with the great multitude. And so then coming back to the seals in chapter 8, I thought, I think there's something here that's more than meets the eye. And, all of us as, preachers probably have different things we like to do or different strengths or weaknesses. But I think one of the things I really like to do as a preacher is I like the texts that I know are going to be at least initially confusing. So and that's probably because, the texts that are more obvious, I'm maybe just not as good at, finding the great illustrations for, John 3:16 or something, we preach through all of it, but I think I really love a hard text, a strange text. So I thought there was a lot there. And that people would probably go, this is just kind of weird and anticlimactic that we have all of this cacophony of sight and sound, and then they rest for about a half an hour. Even the way it's translated in English sounds a little lame. And about just kind of someone looking at their own, it's like, half past. And then they went. So give or take. So I wanted the congregation to think about this because I thought there was more there than meets the eye, and that I didn't want to move by it too quickly.
And the conclusions were that silence is actually preceding the judgment of God's, which has come as a result of the prayers rising. Is that right?
Yeah, right. So sometimes in preaching through Revelation, my outline is nothing fancy, and it's just, okay, we got to go through the text slowly to understand it. So recently, when I preached through Revelation 11, it's very confusing, the 2 witnesses and all these numbers. And I just said, here's where we're going, congregation. We're going to stop at almost every phrase. I'm just going to try to explain what's happening, but hold on, we'll get to the end and then sort of wrap it up. But this one was different. I wanted to present ahead of time the big idea, but a little bit of a teaser. So I introduced the sermon as, do you want to make a difference in the world? And of course we all do. And you look at the world around you and it's scary and it's discouraging. And you say, I want to do something. And Revelation 8 tells you how you can make a huge difference in what's happening in our world right now. But I didn't say what that thing was. So, it's still a sermon. I don't know how much of a cliffhanger it was, but I wanted people to say, I do want to make a difference. Hold on, Pastor, you didn't tell me what that is. And then as we go through Revelation 8, 1-5, they're probably thinking, wait a second, how does all this kind of weird stuff have to do with that? And so I brought it around, as you said, to say this is really about the prayers. It's God's prayers, and it's the prayers of the martyrs in chapter 6. It's the prayers of God's people rising. They're taken in the censer and thrown down on the earth. So it becomes a sermon on prayer, but we've all heard lots of sermons on prayer. And so there's no right or wrong here, but I didn't want to just introduce it as a sermon on prayer. Now I could have done that, and I could have said, this passage gives us 4 powerful truths as we think about our prayer life. Nothing would have been wrong with that. My sense was people might have tuned out more quickly. Another sermon on prayer, okay. So I did some of those same kind of points, but I did a little more inductively, and and it came to it at the end so that every sermon should be clear. That's one of the, after, truth, I say clarity is king. But when we say every sermon should be clear, that doesn't mean that it has to be, it doesn't mean that there can't be a little bit of, a little bit of confusion as you get to the clarity, meaning people may go, okay, just like a good story, has this, you introduce this character and this idea, and you're like, okay, how does this all connect? So this is one of those sermons. Thought that's okay. It's okay if people are going, okay, that's interesting. I'm learning something. How does this all come together? And then hopefully at the end, now that they've had the passage explained, I think they're more ready to land on the conclusion, which has to do with the power of prayer.
I can testify. I definitely found that in listening to the sermon. I was like, oh, come on, where's the answer? And then it came.
Yeah.
Kevin, one of the things I noticed is that you talked about the Old Testament quite a bit, the peals of thunder, the trumpets, the earthquakes, and you used it to explain the language and the ideas in these verses. Why did you choose to use the Old Testament as an interpretive tool for this passage?
It's always important when preaching the New Testament, to use the Old Testament as an interpretive tool. Certainly, books of the New Testament, you have writers who they understand, they're conversant with philosophy. We see Paul quote some of them. They may be in the milieu of Stoic terms. They may have, certainly they're speaking into the world of the Roman Empire. So all of that is true. And yet I believe very strongly that the most fundamental mental framework for every author of the Bible is the Old Testament. And if we come at it, it's not that the other things don't matter, the cultural context, and, certainly I think, the 7 hills are a reference to Rome, and it's important to know something about Laodicea when the angel says, Jesus says, I want you neither hot nor cold. I think it's important to know something about, well, there were hot springs near Laodicea. There were cold springs. Jesus is not saying, hey, lukewarm Christians, I'd rather you be really wicked than lukewarm. No, that's not the point. He's saying, I'd rather you be good for something, because cold water is good for something, hot water. So yes, we need to know about geography and cultural context, but most important, their mental framework is the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. Undoubtedly, they knew their Bibles better than we do. just because it's what they learned, what they memorized, what they were steeped in, less of a cultural language barrier, all of that. Mm-hmm. So if we don't enter that mental conceptual framework, if we jump in to think, how might this, what might the strange locust with lady's hair, what could that look like today, rather than what sort of images are they heaping up upon each other? So, I mean, if somebody is I'm trying to think of something very British, but I don't know, Big Ben or something, or, an English breakfast or something that, the Beatles, we can all share that in common. If somebody 1,000 years from now were uncovering something and it was, quoting some lines of Paul McCartney, and, some PhD student is trying to unearth what these mean, we all say, if we could, go there in the future, we'd say, listen, everybody knows what this is about. Yeah. Everybody knows once you do that first line of Yesterday, or we know what Hey Jude means. Yeah. Maybe there was a great movement in 20th century Britain to recover the biblical book of Jude. And there was a movement of Hey Jude. And you just don't know the mental framework. So their mental framework was the Old Testament. And with Revelation in particular, more than any other book, there are more allusions and references to the Old Testament in Revelation than anywhere else. And so almost every single verse, hardly an exaggeration, there's some kind of prophetic imagery. Mm-hmm. Now, here's where the preacher or the Bible study leaders needs to be careful, because you can get really the wheels stuck in the mud if you're just always turning back. Now, read this in Daniel, read this in Ezekiel. So I don't know if I always get it right, but I try to think through, is this a time in the sermon where I just mention? Is this a time where I go back? Is this a time where I read the verse myself? Because all three of those approaches can be right. Sometimes you read the verse. Sometimes you just mention this comes from, Ezekiel 1. And then other times, if it's really important, I'll say, everybody, okay, put your finger there. And I want you to turn back, because I want you to see this with your own eyes. I want you to see where this imagery comes from. It's right here. And I think, almost as much as anything, that helps people understand a book like Revelation, because suddenly they go, oh. And I think Christians and even non-Christians, they really appreciate understanding how the Bible connects with itself. It's a big book. Oh, that makes sense. It's all building to something, and it's all connected. And this imagery didn't come out of nowhere. It has a history to it. And until people see that, Revelation is just going to be impenetrable to them.
So there is a sense in which you're not just trying to teach them what Revelation says, but you're actually trying to model how to read the Bible, how it kind of works together.
Yeah, very good point. It's true. It's caught rather than taught, so much how we read the Bible. So I don't stop and say, here are 3 interpretive principles, though you could do that. But by the time I'm through Revelation, I think my congregation will think, where is this in the Old Testament? What does this imagery mean? How is this verbal picture telling us something about the way in which the world works? And you're now, I know different people have different time constraints, and we maybe in the typical American pulpit maybe have a little bit more time to do it. But that's why I show not all, but some of my exegetical homework in the pulpit, because ultimately I don't want them to just take my word for it. I want them to be convinced that they can see this for themselves.
There was a sense as well, is this right, that you did actually explain things with a kind of contemporary lens and contemporary illustrations? I mean, you had literal silence from your pulpit. You were talking about the aroma of barbecue, which sounds pretty good.
Yeah, right.
You should be on the North Carolina Tourist Board or something like that.
Yeah, you guys listened well.
Did you put that in kind of for the sake of those who maybe wouldn't understand the Old Testament?
Yeah, so there's always this balance that the interpretive grid is not our modern world. It's their world. But we want it to make sense. And so I'm not saying John, the aroma that John's talking about is smoked pig. It'd be strange. But, I just sort of said that at the end, I want people to, because it's hard for us, the aroma. We don't have tabernacles. We don't have temples. We don't go in and, even in good Bible preaching Anglican churches there, they probably don't have lots of incense flying around. So that kind of smell doesn't hit us. So just trying to think of a smell, be it chocolate chip cookies or barbecue or something that kind of hits you. There's a smell. So yes, I want it to make sense. I want people to have some conceptual hooks. So we don't want to say in sermons or suggest you have to go. The idea is go back and live in the first century, because that's impossible. That's not what God's asking us to do. But we do have to go, get in the DeLorean and fly back there and try to understand what they're hearing. But we don't just live there. Then you got to take it back and you got to come back to your own time, back to the future and say, all right, now what do we do with this?
Kevin, at face value, often I find Old Testament history might not sound particularly interesting. I don't know, there's often stories from generations long ago, names we're not familiar with, but you actually made it very accessible to the listener. Are there any principles you try to employ to do that?
Well, thank you. I hope it was interesting. Two things off the top of my head. One, most simply, I remember D.A. Carson saying one time, great Bible teacher and seminary professor, he said, I've learned that people don't learn what I teach them. They learn what I'm excited about. Now, you need to do this in your own context. And, British excitement looks different than other kinds of excitement. I understand. But it is true. If you are if you're doing something from the Old Testament and you seem like you can't wait to be done with it and get over with it, but if you're excited about it and they can sense you've learned something, this is what is so palpable when whether your Bible study or a preacher comes to the pulpit. If people feel like Pastor Kevin was in the study all week and I'm really excited, I learned something. I saw something. I want you to see something. This is really cool. People listen. You could be talking about almost anything. If they sense he saw something, guys, everybody, he saw something. And then the second is more of a intuition to know, when to speed up, when to slow down. So I think often when we do the Old Testament, it's better to retell those stories than to go back and read them all. Because and I just said, sometimes you do go back, but if I'm going back to show something in the Old Testament, it's usually, I want you to see this line. I wouldn't usually go back and say, now let's read the story of Samson or something together. Of course, that's very long, but to tell it and to share it in a way that's interesting, I think people can track with. So there's a boring sort of, you don't want to feel like you're just footnoting your sermons. Okay, footnote this author, footnote this Old Testament text, footnote. Nobody wants to get footnotes. But if you're explaining something, teaching something, sharing a story, I think people can track with you.
Kevin, you had this line, our prayers move the hands of him who moves the worlds. Why do you think John, the author of Revelation, needs his readers to know this about their prayers?
This passage in Revelation 8, as we've said, is strange at first, but then it's a wonderful text about prayer, that the prayers of the saints have been gathered, and then they come crashing down to earth with this force of great power and glory. And as I say at the end of the sermon, I need this message. And I have the experience that I imagine everyone in my congregation has, which is trying to be faithful in prayer. I've prayed lots of prayers, And to be honest, most of the time, it doesn't feel like, a great rocket zooming into heaven. There goes Kevin's prayers blasting out of the atmosphere all the way up into heaven, ready to come crashing down. It feels, just like a little, bitwad that comes out and falls to the ground, a little pea shooter. And so I think John's audience needs to hear this, and we need to hear it, to say your prayers, simple, faithful prayers in Jesus' name, are more powerful than you could possibly imagine. So I didn't want a lot of sermons that end on prayer, end on the will. You have to pray. Okay, that's okay sometimes. Go pray more. I wanted to land on the heart so that you would want to pray more, that you would feel like, of course, how could I neglect this rich privilege we have? And I think the text allowed me in a very exegetically warranted way to speak to the heart of the person in the pew or in the chair. There will always be several times in my sermon, sometimes I'll mark it in the side of my notes, or other times it's just up in my head, that I think that's a preaching moment. And what I mean is 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times where, okay, I'm doing the exegesis, I'm walking through, I'm explaining, I'm defending, I'm applying, but then it's like, okay, I want to speak to the heart now. And this is where it lands. Congregation, I know you probably feel like I do, that your prayers don't do much. And prayer is hard, isn't it? And your prayers feel very weak. They feel limp. They feel like they don't do anything. This passage tells, so that kind of preaching to the heart is what I think is often missing in a lot of even good, faithful, expositional sermons, that we're not just there to help people understand what the text says, though that's of first importance. But then, that they have that moment where, the sheep hear his voice and wow, Jesus is saying something to me in this moment.
Kevin, in your sermon, you were saying that we are particularly praying for Jesus' coming, for his return. I just wanted to push you a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I want to see Jesus' return when justice is complete, when wrongs are righted. But I also want a lot right now. I want time with my friends, that they would be saved, that I have time to speak to them of this gospel. How do we deal with that tension?
Yeah. Of course, Revelation ends, the Spirit and the bride say, come. So I think that the fundamental heart cry of the Christian is, I want to see Jesus. I want to see Jesus as soon as I can see Jesus. And yet, apart from Jesus coming back, just think about when you die, you see Jesus, but we don't want to go and die. We want to live, and so your question about the tension, Paul gets that famously in Philippians. He wants to go to be with the Lord, but there's also work to be done. And so I would just say this, first of all, if a Christian feels that in their heart, good for you, because you have lost friends, you really care for them, you really want them to come to Christ. So that's a really good thing. You're thinking about your parents or your kids or something. But I would say don't hesitate to pray that prayer. Don't hesitate to want Christ to come back, because he knows more than you and I know. His timing is better than our timing. And he's not going to come back until all of his elect are gathered in, to all of our people. So don't think that, oh man, I'm going to be too fervent in praying for Jesus to come back and I'm going to mess something up. Somebody's not going to get saved who is supposed to get saved. God's going to do all the work that he needs to do before he returns.
Kevin, can you just give us a sense of how this sermon was received by your congregation? Were they encouraged by it?
Nationwide revival broke out.
Wow. Oh,
wow. I think it was received well. Like I said earlier, it is one of those passages that on the face of it doesn't seem like much. So, I had a number of people. And what does a pastor know? We always have to be careful. You only hear from some people. And, the feedback mechanism I mainly have, sometimes there's some emails or texts that come after, but mainly it's people coming through the line. And so there was a lot of, I never knew what that half hour meant. I always wondered what that silence could possibly be about. Wow, this makes a lot more sense. So I think people were encouraged. One, they understood the text and they probably hadn't ever really thought too much about that or understood it. And number two, I think they were encouraged in their prayer life. And we have lots of, prayer warriors. And I think the congregation as a whole took encouragement that our prayers matter and that God pays more attention to our prayers than maybe we do.
I was just 2 days ago, needed to go to a very, very early morning prayer meeting. And at the moment, London is exceptionally cold, exceptionally dark. I'd have to cycle there. And I really thought about not going. But actually, I thought, no, Leo, that is the history-changing meeting, the prayer meeting. That is where history is made. And so, the sermon definitely got one more person at that prayer meeting. So thank you very much.
Well, that's very good. There's an old quip. It's not exactly true, but, that the people come to the morning service if they like the music. They come to the evening service if they like the preacher, and they come to the prayer meeting if they like Jesus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So there's, I hope they like Jesus at all of them. But there's something about, the prayer meeting, you add as an article of faith. You have to believe that getting up and cycling in cold London, this is not wasted religious activity. This is how God works and how the world changes.
They had good croissants as well.
Always helps.
Yeah, it helps.
And some pret-a-manger, yes.
Kevin, we always ask our guests on the podcast that if you were preaching this passage again, would there be anything that you would want to change?
I'm sure would be things to change. I don't think I'm particularly good at giving illustrations. So I think the sermon would have been better, at the end talking about prayer, if there would have been, a great illustration about someone praying, about something in history, about someone contemporary. I think that could have been better. I didn't go back and look to see how long it was, but one of the things I know I need to always work on is I get to the end and I feel rushed. And that's where, and I think a lot of preachers do that. They got lots and lots of content. And I always know I need to make sure at the end especially is where, maybe the most heart work is happening. And you don't want to feel like, I'm rushed. The organist is already getting ready to hit the final chord. So just make sure I have enough time at the end and maybe a couple of illustrations.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for speaking to us today. Thank you for your work in Revelation. It's been so encouraging listening to this series as well as hearing more of your thoughts today. And thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
Great to be with you. Love to talk about preaching and love that you're asking people about their sermons and their studies. So blessings.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bible Matters podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not like and subscribe on whatever platform you get your podcasts? The Bible Matters project is funded entirely by the generous gifts of our listeners. And if you yourself would like to become a financial partner with us, you can find more details on how to give in the show notes. The Bible Matters podcast is an initiative of St. Helens Bishopsgate and is created by myself, Leo Elborn, along with Tiff Stromsay. Music for this episode was written and produced by me, Leo Elborn, and Josh Stidwell. You can listen to more of Josh's work at Stids with a 1, that's ST1DS. Thanks again for joining, and we hope to see you again soon.